My name's Jeff Macker. I'm a professor of economics policy and strategy in the McDonough School of Business at Georgetown University. I'm also the academic director for the Center for Business and Public Policy, and I help organize and run that center with John Mayo, the executive director of the Center for Business and Public Policy. Most of you probably know or have been to some of the events that CBPP has held before. We're a nonpartisan research institute within the McDonough School of Business, and we're focused on issues that are at the nexus of business and public policy. So think any public policy issue that might affect firms, and then how firms might attempt to shape those public policies. We host a variety of events in and around Washington within the school, Georgetown, the Georgetown Law Center, the School of Continuing Studies, the building that you're in right now. They range from conferences to colloquia to simple Georgetown on the Hill events, all types of things. Our research output is white papers and journal articles that mainly have an economic lens. So we try to bring good economic thought to any one of the questions that we're attempting to look at and attempting to answer. This is one type of event that we hold, an economic summit on America's digital infrastructure 2017 and beyond. I'm actually pretty excited about this event, mainly because of the people that are taking part of it, from the moderators to the panelists. It's, if you will, an all-star cast. I didn't have anything to do with it, but I tell you, the people that did a heck of a job of organizing some people that I think are really going to provide some thought-provoking, make some thought-provoking points. We're going to focus on 3 panels, one on policies, one on lessons, and one on proposals. As the new administration comes in, as we shift from one administration to the other, I'm going to be very brief in my remarks, which means I've already talked too long. So with that, let me introduce the keynote address from Howard Shelanski. Howard is the current administrator of the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs. I should stop first and say 2 other things. Please put your cell phones in silent mode if you haven't already. And then when we do get to Q&A, please wait for the mic, introduce yourself, and ask your question. And it should be in the form of a question versus a form of your resume. Okay? With that, let me introduce Howard. He's the current administrator of the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs with the OMB. Prior to that, he was at the Bureau of Economics at the FTC, and he was chief economist at the FCC. Howard has spent a lot of time at 2 places that I love, UC Berkeley and Georgetown University. I first met Howard in 1997, I believe, when I was Oliver Williamson's research assistant. And one of the requirements of Oliver Williamson, a very famous economist who won the Nobel Prize, was you had to collect his mail. You had to collect his mail at his affiliated law school, Department of Economics, and business school. And when I would go to collect his mail, Howard had an office in Bolt, near the law school, right next to where the mail was collected, and he would laugh and laugh as I picked up the mail. Little did I know that he had to do the same thing about 4 years prior. So with that, Howard, thank you so much for leading us off in a keynote.
Thanks. It's great to be here. What Jeff didn't tell you is we still collect Ollie's mail for him. Only now we have to deliver it up to northern Wisconsin, which is really a challenge. It's a pleasure to be here. As a once and future Georgetown professor, it's nice to think about coming back to events like this and doing some thinking with a lot of people who are involved with both policy and a lot of the important research work in areas that are very important to me, telecommunications and digital communications in particular, but more generally regulation and competition policy. I want to talk a little bit about some broad themes that might relate to digital investment and digital infrastructure in the United States, and just talk about some of the basic challenges we face, some of the importance of competition, and some of the competition initiatives and competition policy angles that might relate to digital investment and innovation, and then talk a little bit about regulatory structure and some things that the government can do, perhaps to further stimulate digital investment and innovation. And I'll talk in a minute about why I'm separating investment and innovation, because I think these are related but distinct concepts. Let me say a word about what I do in the government, just so you can see where I relate to a lot of the issues that most of you in this room spend your time thinking about. My office is an executive branch office that reviews executive branch regulations. So environmental regulations, labor regulations, various kinds of health regulations, you name it. But you will not find in that box telecommunications regulation, because that is, of course, the province of an independent agency that does not and should not fall under the jurisdiction of my office. So I speak with some detachment about things related to telecommunications, but also in the parlance of government, some humility about the fact that it's really not my lane as an official matter to talk about these things. So I may steer clear of a few specifics that are really the province of other folks within the government, but I'd be happy to take questions on a range of topics afterwards if you want to go a little more deeply into some of the things that I have not spoken very specifically about. So let me talk generally about what I think some of the challenges are for digital infrastructure, digital technology right now from a public policy perspective. I think there is a complex set of challenges for regulation and public policy surrounding digital infrastructure. I think one important question is, how do we maintain innovation as the market matures and becomes more uncertain? And when I say the market matures, I think we tend to think very conventionally about information services when we think about digital infrastructure. Of course, it's much broader than that. But a lot of the demand-side drivers of digital technology at this point are fairly mature after what is in fact a rather short period of time. So the question is, what are the new drivers on the demand side that are likely to drive investment and innovation in digital technology and digital infrastructure? How do we ensure competition in digital services? I'd say competition to the extent appropriate. I'll get to that in a moment. Especially as we see firms that used to be startups that were the sort of ground-level innovators becoming incumbents. We see a lot of vertical and horizontal transactions where new technology is being acquired by these incumbents. On one hand, that's a great thing. It stimulates the production of that new technology. On the other hand, there may be competition concerns and concerns about the cycles, the life cycle, and the introduction of follow-on technologies being slower than it might be without the competitive pressure that would have resulted absent some of these acquisitions. Something that I think a lot about, being in an office that reviews executive branch regulations and wants to make those regulations as welfare enhancing and as efficient as possible. How do we ensure a regulatory structure that incentivizes rather than dampens innovation, whether digital or otherwise? I'll say a couple things about what I think about when I think about incentive enhancing regulation. And finally, how can government resources be used to spur investment and innovation in digital technology? Let me start with the competition question. I think that competition is, without a doubt, valuable, particularly when one talks about the deployment of technology that's already been developed. If one looks over the history of telecommunications, and I mean, let's go way back and look at a sample of technologies from the middle of the 20th century on, and start to look at how long it took those technologies to really penetrate the marketplace, to be deployed to 30 or 50% of whatever the relative metric for market deployment was. One sees a rather interesting correlation. I looked at a sample a few years ago of 10 important telecom technologies over the course of the 20th century. And I looked at the market structure in which those technologies were introduced. Now, these technologies already existed. I took the question of what spurred their innovation as a separate question. But what led to how did competition relate to the speed of deployment was really the question I was looking at. And what one saw was a pretty clear correlation, and it was just a correlation, not a causal relationship, because there were too many other things going on. As one moved from monopoly to duopoly/triopoly to a reasonably competitive market of 5 or 6 firms. The deployment times, the average deployment times dropped quite considerably from about 14 years down to about 5 years, down to about 3 years across this sample of technologies. And what this suggested was if there was a technology that was out there that was not monopolistically possessed, so that there were other players out there in the marketplace who could deploy the technology, you tended to get faster deployment with more firms in the market. And that fits a fairly conventional microeconomic story. And it also suggests that when we look at the market, the digital marketplace today, we might think about what leads firms to implement the innovations and the technology that is already out there to be implemented. To be sure, there's a whole demand side question. What's the cost of producing the technology? What are people willing to pay for these technologies? But once the cost drops, what you tend to get is a strategic management of implementation and deployment of new technologies. Obviously, people don't want to cannibalize what they've got in place. And so they will optimally time the deployment of new technology to coincide with sort of the payoff and the drop-off in consumer demand for the older technology. So more competition, I think, will tend to drive firms to put these newer technologies that already exist into the market sooner. So I think competition policy is going to be an important part of the picture for digital technology. Now, I'm talking about deployment of new technology. The relationship between market structure and innovation, as a lot of people in this room are well aware, is a lot more complex. It's not crystal clear that a competitive market structure is always optimal for new kinds of innovation and starting from scratch in doing the R&D for new technologies. And, we can go back and talk about the old Schumpeter-Arrow debate. Do monopolistic firms that have lots of rents that they can plow back into the R&D function, are they going to do the big breakthrough innovations? Or is it going to be fringe firms forced by competitive pressures to come up with something new that are going to introduce the new technology? Arrow, in what is I think a sort of unfortunate caricature of the debate, is argued to have come down on the side of competition. Schumpeter more on the side of monopoly. Both sides, both scholars had obviously much more nuanced views. But I think what the current literature is showing, and there's really great work by Philippe Aghion at Harvard in this area, is that something that Mike Shearer came up with in the 60s turns out to be to have a lot of empirical validation, which is that you really get a peak of innovation at sort of an oligopoly market structure. So pure competition isn't ideal because you don't have the rents to invest in R&D. Pure monopoly isn't ideal because you don't really have the incentives to innovate. And so you have an inverse U relationship between market structure and innovation, and somewhere around that oligopoly structure of 4 or 5 firms, you get optimal levels of innovation. Mike Shearer came up with this in the 60s. He didn't really have the data or the econometric technique to make a convincing case, but Aghion, along with Rachel Griffiths at Oxford, I think has done a really good job of showing that there's something to this relationship. I love that relationship for the following reason. If one looks at the horizontal merger guidelines that the FTC and the DOJ use, when they're thinking about mergers, they tend to think about an oligopoly market structure that happens to correspond rather nicely with the market structure that the data seem to show will most often correlate well with high levels of innovation. So antitrust policy, at least as framed in the guidelines, may be well tuned both for deployment and innovation of new technologies. But that law has to be enforced. So I do think that competition enforcement, good competition policy, will be an important piece of digital innovation and deployment going forward. Recently, President Obama issued an executive order on competition. And the motivation for the executive order was the observation that there were sectors of the economy that had become increasingly consolidated in recent decades, and where the rents being earned by the firms in those sectors were really quite high. And and it's well known, a lot of the high levels of cash holdings that these firms earning high rents are not being plowed back into investment in innovation, at least at the rate that conventional economic models might suggest. So there was really a thought that maybe we need to look more broadly at ways to push competition and competitive values out through the economy beyond the antitrust laws. The antitrust laws are limited, quite properly limited in their scope. There's a whole judicial common law that has grown up around, again, I think quite appropriately, around antitrust law. What other things can be done to create the kinds of competitive pressures that I think will be beneficial both for competition and innovation in digital technology and digital infrastructure? That is really a question that falls logically out of the observations that were made. And what the Competition Executive Order does is it asks regulatory agencies, beyond the antitrust agencies, to look hard at what authorities they have to get rid of regulations that might unintendedly have the effect of preserving incumbents and not opening up the door to competition. And then in a more affirmative way, what regulations can they issue that might enforce and add to competition in the marketplace? I think it's a much easier ask and a safer ask to ask firms to ask regulatory agencies to remove regulations that maybe impede competition than to create new regulations that create competition. That latter task is a very difficult one. But the executive order certainly looks at both, and it applies to all agencies, not just executive branch agencies. So the FCC has a set of marching orders, implicitly that come out of this. The most well-known of which is the current debate before the Commission over the set-top box market, about which I will not say more. But that was one of the specific things that came out of the Competition Executive Order. Interesting question. In terms of digital innovation, digital technology deployment and investment, what would the set-top box order do? Is this a pro-competitive move that is good for consumers and will open up a lot of new technologies? That's certainly the argument that motivated the EO. It's an argument that I believe. On the other hand, there are strong contrary arguments, and those are what the FCC has been debating and what a lot of people out there in the marketplace, and I imagine in this room, will be debating. And there are other regulatory actions that have obviously taken place. The network neutrality rule, again, hotly debated, is designed at least to make sure that market power is not used in certain parts of the digital infrastructure, and that entry and competition remains vibrant and on a level playing field in another part of the digital universe. That's, it's sort of the core versus edge story that is often told. Network neutrality makes sure we don't have things being blocked up and market power being leveraged at the core so that we can keep innovation at the edge. Important question, as the market develops, as the needs of the market develop, how do we balance the relative merits of core versus edge? Is there a point at which the thumb on the scales favoring openness at the edge might tilt back towards more flexibility and freedom of contracting of business practices in the core to stimulate more investment? These are going to be the hard questions going forward if one thinks dynamically about where network neutrality goes in the future. And I think that what's important about network neutrality is the principle is a vital one, but I think it has to remain a nimble concept as business practices change, as contractual structures in the industry change, as technologies change. So I'm just going to hazard a really radical, conjecture here that we haven't had the last word on the issue of network neutrality. Daring, I know. I want to move next to how regulation generally might be structured to be more incentive enhancing than incentive dampening when it comes to new technology. And this is a broader point than just for digital technology. It's a general point. But a long time ago, we crossed the threshold of recognizing that technology standards in regulations were to be avoided if at all possible. What do technology standards do? They tend to lock in a path that is based on a particular technology that exists at a time, very often and unintentionally locking in a market structure too, because the folks who possess that technology and the time frame when the regulation has to be implemented, may be a monopoly or maybe relatively few firms. So the shift to performance-based regulation, where any technology, any method to achieve the performance metric would be allowed, is sort of a good and very helpful concept. But I think we have to move even beyond performance standards, or at least static performance standards that tend to be what we most frequently see in regulation. And let me give you an example from outside the digital framework. Suppose that the Department of Transportation is going to have a noise reduction, this is hypothetical, a noise reduction rule for large trucks. In fact, we have a rule under review on noise enhancement for electric cars, so that people, so that people who are vision impaired or hearing impaired don't get surprised by these vehicles when they silently come down the street. But let's take an opposite hypothetical. How do we reduce noise on trucks? And suppose the Department of Transportation were to say, by January of 2018, all heavy-duty vehicles shall emit no greater than, 14 decibels. I don't even know what that means. I'm picking a random number. That's great. It's a performance standard. It means anywhere in the vehicle that you can use a technology to dampen sound to achieve that standard, you can do. So lots of innovation in how you achieve that. But is anyone going to actually try to develop a technology that does better than 14 decibels? Why would you? Because this rule is going to go in place. It'll be in place for years. Agencies don't want to revisit rules that they've already done unless they're made to by Congress or by my office or something. So they typically will innovate to the standard and then stop. But wouldn't it be better if we kept firms innovating and exceeding the standards? So can we design a regulation that doesn't say simply you're off the hook if you meet 14 decibels by 2018, but it's okay if you don't meet 14 by 2018 if you give us 10 by 2020? Well, that might lead firms to say, okay, fine. I will think more dynamically. I will keep going with some ongoing innovation that I have in place that will exceed that standard. And I will do better in the marketplace than the guy who's got the 14 decibel technology. So can we start structuring regulation to create rewards? You don't have to comply on the initial time frame if you exceed over a longer time frame. What kind of incentives can we build in to do that? What's the stick we would put in place? What if you miss that attempted innovation? Innovation doesn't always succeed. How punitive should we be? What should the penalty be for not hitting that benchmark? Thinking in a more dynamic, incentive-oriented way in regulation, I think, is going to be very important. It's going to be important as the FCC regulates things that affect digital infrastructure. It's going to be important in all areas of innovation. I might add that digital technology is actually something that comes up all over the place. It is a huge cost reducer in anything you can think about in life pretty much right now. So I might be working on a regulation that has to do, for example, with labor violations. Well, the cost of that rule may be dramatically lower if labor violations can be more easily tracked and documented by the Department of Labor through some kind of more sophisticated IT system than previously existed. We tend to find that regulations that are far away from telecom or things that more directly affect what we think about as digital technology can actually have an effect on the scope of implementation of digital technologies. So an incentive-based regulatory system across the board, I think, will be very helpful. Finally, what can the government do in terms of its own resources to stimulate digital technology and both the innovation and the deployment of those innovations in digital technology? Well, one thing that this administration has done is, I think, fully embrace the digital world. The United States Digital Service is a very interesting operation within the administration. It's very large. run by a terrific guy named Mikey Dickerson, who used to be at Google. He cut a deal with the White House. He said, "Can I wear jeans and a plaid shirt?" So you get all these people who show up to meetings, and like, I'm not kidding, they'll show up in the Oval Office in jeans and a plaid shirt. And these are the sort of Silicon Valley inside, and by Silicon Valley, I use that metaphorically more than geographically, inside the administration. And what these folks do is they look at everything anything anyone does in government and says, is there a better way technologically to reduce the number of intermediaries, to cut costs, to increase participation by stakeholders, to better deliver government services? And so you've got folks from the U.S. Digital Services, and Megan Smith is the Chief Technology Officer. She sits atop this whole infrastructure, and they will literally come in and get in your business and say, there is a better way for you to do what you're doing. So think about everything that's been written about how the Department of Veteran Affairs has worked hard and had to overcome backlogs and challenges with the number of veterans awaiting health care services. Somebody from the U.S. Digital Services has gone in as the CTO at the Department of Veteran Affairs and is radically restructuring how veterans file claims, how they get medical services, how they interact with the department, so that information flows much more quickly and freely between the people who need care and the people who are in a position to deliver it, greatly improving care for veterans. So I think when the government does something like this, it creates demand that stimulates innovation, that stimulates firms out there in the world to see a new part of a marketplace and to develop technologies and infrastructures that are suitable for that marketplace. So I think this kind of investment in government innovation is actually a non-trivial force in terms of spin-off innovation in the digital sector. Other areas that I think are emerging, that are going to be areas where government can play a role, but a role in partnership with industry, with academia, with researchers, is two areas that I think are going to be the big emerging challenges, and where there are a number of countries competing, I think, for technological leadership. And those are artificial intelligence, which is moving at a pace that is simply staggering. Machine learning is absolutely remarkable. How that gets built into the digital infrastructure and disintermediates even further a lot of interactions that occur over digital infrastructure, and probably puts a lot of us out of jobs. That's a separate question, is going to be a really important issue. And I think that right now, some of the things you hear about what AI might do seem pretty remote, pie in the sky. I think we're starting to hit the steep part of the S-curve, if you will, and I think we will start to see a very rapid change, especially with countries like China claiming that this is part of their quote-unquote technology moonshot. That's why they're building these super fast computers that they're building. And the other area that was artificial intelligence is semiconductor industry leadership. We've, in the United States, I think, had a massive lead in semiconductor technology. I think we still have a massive lead in semiconductor technology, but it is not unchallenged. I think this rivalry is a good thing, so long as we win. And I think one of the roles that government can play is thinking about what can government do to ensure that industry has the tools, has the personnel, has access to the knowledge that is necessary to maintain leadership in the semiconductor market, which is, of course, going to be critical to how a lot of digital infrastructure develops over time. And just two final things. Cybersecurity is a huge issue. Obviously, the demand for effective cybersecurity technology is huge. I think that market is, as big as it is, has just enormous places to go. I think that's going to be a massive area of investment, and I think we're going to start to see security being built in as part of infrastructure from the ground up. I think this is going to be another major investment driver. And then I think the final thing goes back to probably one of the oldest challenges in telecommunications. I think actually one of the great triumphs, as clunky as it was, of US telecommunications across the 20th century which is assuring access to the relevant telecommunication technology of the day for everybody across the country. So we used to talk about universal service for plain old telephone service. Then we started talking about digital divide. There are still folks who lack adequate and full access to cutting-edge digital technology, and as that becomes more and more part of our everyday life, that is a problem in terms of income inequality, access to jobs. But thinking about it from the perspective of this conference, I think we should also recognize that any moves that are made to increase the penetration of the most advanced digital telecommunications technology and the accessibility of that technology will lead to increased usage, increased demand for new deployment and innovation, and can help to stimulate the demand side drivers for digital infrastructure and technology. Thanks.
Questions?
Or better yet, answers.
Thank you. Yes, my name is Sarah Tyree, and I work for CoBank. We're a cooperative bank our mission is to serve rural America. And so we are probably one of the largest private lenders to rural telecommunication companies all across the U.S. But when you have a lack of financial incentive for any private company to deploy broadband in high-cost rural areas, you can't underestimate the need for a robust Connect America Fund, Universal Service Fund, and all of the amazing benefits that affordable broadband will bring for these rural areas for decreasing the cost of a lot of federal services. It just is very important. And so where do you see this moving forward in the future, and what do you think the next steps are?
I mean, I think it's a great question, and I would say that the two Toms, Tom Wheeler and Tom Vilsack, would be in a lot better position to tell you where it's likely to go in the future. I do know there is a strong commitment to making sure it does go forward in the future and maintaining the robustness of Connect America and other kinds of initiatives, because I think there's a recognition that on the demand side, the incentives just aren't there to do the tremendously expensive build-out. And I would also note that we need to look at the whole regulatory package that is out there that might affect incentives to build out. We don't have cross-subsidies in the way that we used to. There may be other cross-subsidies in the system, but you can't simply tell somebody, go out there and build. So I think what we need to look at is what can be done to make sure that once the infrastructure is built, that it is a viable, profitable infrastructure for the people who own and maintain it. And if not, to think more about where might there be places where we actually need public infrastructure. But I think making sure there is funding is one piece of the picture. Making sure there's a regulatory system that makes the investment sustainable once made, and the upkeep and the reinvestment and continued connectivity of that infrastructure is going to be very important. And I don't know where it's going to go exactly in the future, but I don't see it's hard for me to imagine a future in which that problem does not get solved.
Hi, I'm John Windhausen, Schools, Health and Libraries Broadband Coalition. Maybe a related question, or picking up on that, my question is the U.S. digital service that you mentioned. Is there an opportunity for that agency or group to look at the FCC's Universal Service Fund and examine how that could be done more efficiently?
That's a great question, John, and I mean it's certainly one I will actually take back and mention to the head of USDS. Here I think is the issue there. Right now, they are so busy getting the federal government itself modernized in terms of the technology and the service delivery that it has in place. If, in effect, the digital infrastructure of the U.S. government, when we think about universal service, schools and libraries, Connect America, we might ask, what is the right way technologically to think about what should be done and how these services should be delivered? I think USDS folks would be sort of, along with many others, really valuable consultants on that. They would have to be asked in to work on this by the FCC, and probably what they would say is, here's your number, we'll be there, take a seat, we'll be there as soon as we can, because they are overwhelmed. But I do think down the road, it's the kind of thing that they could be very useful to help think about, as hopefully that initiative will continue. USDS will become a permanent part of the government. As that happens, they can start to move from consultants and experts on how the government delivers services to a consulting body of expertise within the government on anything that involves the funding or subsidization, if you will, of digital technology. It's a great idea. Easy crowd.
Hello, Kyle Burgess, Consumers Research, also a student of yours. It doesn't sound like this falls under the purview of your office, but is there any government agency that is looking into the effects of things like net neutrality on investment in broadband and other wired services? Has it decreased? Where would I find this information?
Well, you won't find it yet, because just enough time hasn't gone by. So there is an initiative in place that I think would lead very nicely to that kind of evaluation, that kind of ex post evaluation of how the rule is working. In 2010, President Obama issued an executive order asking agencies, all agencies, executive branch and independent agencies, to do retrospective review of the rules they have on the book. And what my office does is requires agencies to report twice a year on their retrospective review initiatives. In standing that initiative up, one confronts immediately the hard reality, which is not a surprise, that agencies are focused on doing the new things they need to do and are a lot less interested in stopping and turning around and looking again at what they have already done. So a lot of what we have been doing is putting in place getting agencies in the habit of thinking about what are a list of things we could look at retrospectively, putting in place the teams of people who will have the responsibility and the accountability to deliver on those, and then actually getting some of these things done. So one of the things that I could foresee happening is once there is enough time to actually have reasonable metrics, and when one's talking about innovation and investment and things like that, I think you need to let a good number of years go by. But there will be a point when the FCC, I think, would quite reasonably put on one of its biannual lists, we're going to look at network neutrality rule and see what's happening. Has there been a decrease in the rate of investment beyond what we would have reasonably predicted to occur absent the rule? And that counterfactual is always a very difficult analysis to do. But have we dampened innovation? Or, on the other hand, has it had no effect and we've kept a great flow of new technologies coming in from what I will kind of coarsely call the edge? But there is an initiative in place. There is a reporting sort of system in place. And I could imagine somebody in my position 5 or 10 years from now calling the FCC and saying, why don't you take a look at net neutrality? I would also add that part of the retrospective review initiative involves public input. So the public can ask, we want Rule X to be looked at. So I think there's a way for there to be public pressure also to get the commission to look at that.
Any questions?
Hi, my name is John Miley. I cover technology at Kiplinger. It's not exactly digital infrastructure, but obviously part of it. I'm curious if you could talk a little bit more about the semiconductor market and the lead that we should sort of strive to have. Are you thinking mostly about China or other countries that are getting more competitive?
You know, I think I would keep my remarks quite general, which is just to say the semiconductor industry has been, you know, a major piece of the industrial landscape and a real area of major leadership and innovation and success for American industry. And I don't mean to suggest for a minute that there isn't incredibly vibrant and important investment and learning and research going on in that industry here in the United States. There is. And I think the real question is, what can we do to support it to make sure that all that private initiative continues to keep us in the lead with that technology as it becomes increasingly vital for many other kinds of functions on which I think we need to stay a step ahead, things like cybersecurity. So I don't think about it necessarily in terms of competition with any specific country, although, you know, one can read, you know, certainly news reports and things that suggest that there are particular countries that are trying to challenge the leadership. I try to think of it as what can the government do to make sure that industry, which is the leader, has all of the support it needs. What additional things can government do from all kinds of policy angles to help it maintain that lead, and then to recognize the vital strategic importance of that need for all these other technologies that are going to be critical going forward.
From the Center for Public and Business Policy, it seems that recently there has been a lot of disagreement between the commissioners at the FCC regarding a lot of policymaking rules. Can you comment on that? And is there something systematically wrong in the way the policymaking process works? Thank you.
I have no comment. I will just say I think it is inherent in the nature of a bipartisan commission that there will be healthy debate and disagreement, and the hope would be that that leads over time to better debated and better thought out policies, but I have no specific comment on the FCC.
Hi, Will Reinhardt with the American Action Forum. One of the things I saw recently is actually this small little device that you can actually put on your glass, like in a room, that will then cancel out noise. You're talking about the noise reduction rule, but it was kind of unclear to me that noise reduction is exactly the innovation that we would want. Perhaps there are other variables that we would actually want to tweak and optimize. In the very, very beginning of this talk, you talked about investment and innovation and how they aren't necessarily related. So how do you actually define innovation? How do we know this, that we're actually achieving innovation with our regulatory structures?
So I think that's a great question. You know, one of the things that there are a number of things you can do. You can look at the baseline. There are various metrics of innovation. Every metric of innovation that you can come up with is imperfect. You know, all the work that Wesley Cohen and Rick Levin and people did in the 80s and 90s pointed out, I think, the problems with all the metrics. So it's a hard thing to get a handle on. What I would suggest, the way I would suggest somebody answer that question is to do a baseline, look at the baseline of all kinds of metrics you might come up with, and look at how those various things might have changed once a regulation is in place. Have those metrics stayed strong while or have people retreated from doing certain kinds of, patent production or other kinds of things that might be taken as metrics of innovation. But I like your point, and I think it's an important one. We might want to, and again, it was a hypothetical rule that I was using about truck noise reduction, but one thing is to say that trucks have to reduce noise. The other thing is to say the industry has to make sure that people hear less noise. Well, that's two different things. The truck can still emit, but this device that you talk about that you put on a glass that silences the room, and I'm sorry, I'm thinking about students getting hold of these things and faculty standing up in front of the room going, it's very interesting. So the question is, how do you write a rule even more broadly dynamic that, and I think that's very much in the spirit of what I'm talking about. Let's think outside the box about the broadest kind of performance goal we could come up with. And getting beyond the truck to the ear might open up a whole new realm of innovation. And that's what I mean by sort of more innovation incentivizing and more dynamic regulation. And that's the kind of thinking that I think we need to have and continue to implement going forward.
Excuse me, Rich Clark, AT&T. Can I come back to one of the first comments you made on the administration's initiative to try to increase competition in the economy? That, it struck me the initial focus appears to be looking under the traditional, rounding up the usual suspects and looking under the traditional streetlights in terms of, well, for all regulated industries, we should try to figure out a way to improve regulation. But just huge swaths of the national economy are not regulated. Software, semiconductors, all of these ones, so very important roles to play in this. So I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about how the initiative might be expanded. And also, there were a couple other comments that Jason Furman made in his speech concerning things like distribution of income between capital and labor and these type of items that seem to be relatively macroeconomic as opposed to individual industry specific. And just what attempts do you think might be useful to try to expand the scope of this initiative to make it more likely to be successful on an overall basis?
I mean, you ask a hard question. The executive order is really in some ways a first step. It works with existing authorities, existing areas of regulation. I think to look beyond those, there are certainly macroeconomic things that can be done through tax policy and many other things, labor policy, a lot of the regulations that the Department of Labor has done, some of which are currently being challenged, but these are rules really designed to build and support middle-class incomes as we move towards the bottom of the income scale, to reduce that kind of inequality. The census report that came out recently that showed, record levels of people moving up and out of poverty over the last few years. One can look at all the tools that have led to that to get at the macroeconomic kinds of variables, the income distribution variables that Jason Furman has written and spoken about recently. In terms of using the competition tool to achieve that in areas outside of areas that already have relevant regulation, I mean, that is first and foremost Congress's purview, and I think rightly so. I think one would want to think hard about, for example, creating new regulatory structures for areas that are not currently regulated in order to be able to achieve greater competitiveness. And I think one would have to think hard about whether those tools are appropriate and better for achieving the macroeconomic goals than other tools that more directly affect the macroeconomy.
If you don't mind me asking a second question.
Go ahead, John.
I was fascinated by your comments about oligopolies perhaps being the best market structure to favor innovation and investment. And I've started to wonder how that related to 5G and the wireless industry. I mean, I think today we have a wireless industry that sort of fits that model, but I've heard some comment that to build the infrastructure to support 5G, maybe it's going to be inefficient or difficult for all four major wireless carriers to build separate 5G infrastructures.
So let me step back and say that, in describing the research that suggested oligopoly structure was, on the whole, sort of a good place to be for innovation. I was articulating that as sort of a descriptive more than a normative case, and I think more research and more evidence needs to be marshaled. And how that plays out, importantly, in any specific case is what's hard to know. There are going to be lots of exceptions to that correlation, if you will. Now it's more sophisticated than a correlation that Aghion and Griffiths and the folks working on this have come up with. But you know, I do think there will be, one has to look case by case. So I think that the 5G story bears out, or at least is consistent with the oligopoly story in the technology has been developed. Now there's a question of the infrastructure that allow the technology to be deployed. And my only thought is this: I think one is more likely to get build out if there is some degree of competition. How much build out is efficient, and whether there is more competition than is optimal for a fast build out is an age-old problem in, you know, in economics and regulation. You know, I hate to use the words natural monopoly. I don't think monopolies are often natural. I think they're often called that after they've been regulated and created over, you know, it's certainly, but they can exist, and the dynamics that sort of constitute a natural monopoly can exist. And I think it's always a hard question of whether multiple entities building out the same expensive infrastructure is better than some kind of intervention that would give one the lead and then have others come in. All I will say is, as a general matter, if I have to pick, I pick competition and letting it sort itself out.
Okay.
Great, thank you.